Let me begin by making a few points which I think there is not a whole lot of disagreement about. First, the United States today is in the midst of the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. Over 16% of working-age Americans are unemployed or underemployed, working 20 hours a week when they would like to be working 40 hours a week. Long-term unemployment is the highest on record. In other words, when people are losing their jobs now, it's not a question of weeks to gain a new job, but in some cases, 6 months or 8 months, or perhaps not at all. In the midst of this economic crisis, millions of Americans have lost their homes, they've lost their savings, and they've lost their pensions. Second point, the United States today has a $13 trillion national debt and a record-breaking $1.6 trillion deficit. Last year alone, the federal government spent over $186 billion just paying interest on that debt. We are leaving our children and grandchildren a huge financial obligation which not only will impact them personally, but affect the well-being of our entire country in the midst of a strong and competitive global economy. Third point, the United States today has the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country. Today, as this chart indicates, the top 1% earn more income than the bottom 50%. Let me repeat that. Top 1% earn more income than the bottom 50%, and the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. Top 1%, bottom 90%. And what we have is a nation in which, in many ways, we are moving toward an oligarchic form of society, with a small number of people on the top seeing a huge increase in their wealth and income while the middle class collapses and poverty increases. During the Bush years, when the middle class saw a $2,200 decline in median family income declined $2,200, the 400 wealthiest families in our country saw their income more than double. Top 400 double, ordinary Americans a decline in median family income. Meanwhile, while the very rich became much richer, their effective income tax rates were slashed almost in half over the past 15 years. Rich get richer, their effective income tax rates go down. The wealthiest 400 Americans have now accumulated $1.27 trillion in wealth. 400 families, $1.27 trillion in wealth, while the highest paid 400 Americans had an average income of $345 million in 2007 alone. As a result of Bush's tax policy, these very high-income people pay an effective tax rate of 16.6%, the lowest on record. Rich get richer, their effective tax rates go down, lowest on record. Mr. President, as I think you may have heard, Warren Buffett, one of the very wealthiest people on this planet, has often made the point that he, a multi-billionaire, pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary pays. Last point I want to make before I get on to the substance. Last month, a gentleman named Dan Duncan, who happened to be the wealthiest person in Houston, Texas, passed away. He left his family some $9 billion. For the first time since 1916, in almost 100 years, somebody in the top echelon brackets, like a Mr. Duncan, will have a situation where his heirs will pay zero inheritance tax, not a nickel. That's the first time that a multimillionaire or billionaire has died in 100 years, and their family has not paid 1 penny in inheritance taxes. This occurred as a result of President Bush's $1.35 trillion tax break enacted into law in 2001. In other words, at a time when this country has a devastatingly high rate of unemployment, at a time when the Senate refused to extend unemployment benefits to desperate people who, through no fault of their own, have lost their jobs and have no income, at a time when we have a huge national debt, at a time when we have massive unmet needs, including a crumbling infrastructure and the need to transform our energy system, at a time when we have a growing gap between the very rich and everyone else, we have a situation now where the very wealthiest people in this country are seeing when someone in their family dies, their estate tax is zero. Mr. President, a century ago, President Teddy Roosevelt, a good Republican, called for a graduated inheritance tax on wealthy estates. In 1916, Congress passed that law. Interestingly enough, here is what Republican Teddy Roosevelt said in 1910, and I quote Teddy Roosevelt: "The absence of effective state and especially national restraint upon unfair money-getting has tended to create a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their power. The prime need is to change the conditions which enable these men to accumulate power, which is not for the general welfare that they should hold or exercise. No man should receive a dollar unless that dollar has been fairly earned." Let me repeat, Teddy Roosevelt, 100 years ago. No man should receive a dollar unless that dollar has been fairly earned. Every dollar received should represent a dollar's worth of service rendered, not gambling in stocks, but service rendered. The really big fortune, the swollen fortune, by the mere fact of its size, acquires qualities which differentiate it in kind as well as in degree from what is passed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, Teddy Roosevelt, 100 years ago, therefore, I believe in a graduated income tax on big fortunes and in another tax which is far more easily collected and far more effective, a graduated inheritance tax on big fortunes properly safeguarded against evasion and increasing rapidly in amount with the size of the estate. End of quote. Teddy Roosevelt, 1910. Mr. President, not many Republicans I agree with today, but I do agree with what Teddy Roosevelt said 100 years ago. And that is exactly what the Responsible Estate Tax Act that I have introduced, along with Senators Harkin, Whitehouse, Franken, and Sherrod Brown, will do. Specifically, this legislation exempts the first $3.5 million of an inheritance from paying any federal estate tax whatsoever. Doing this means that 99.7% of Americans, 99.7% of Americans who receive an inheritance will not pay 1 penny in federal estate taxes. This legislation would impact only the very wealthy, the top 0.3%. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, this legislation over a 10-year period would bring in $315 billion, a significant step forward in addressing our national debt. But, Mr. President, this legislation would do something even more important. In the midst of these enormously difficult times, this legislation makes clear that we are one country and that all Americans must accept shared responsibility. In my view, it is immoral, it is unfair that while the middle class struggles to survive, millionaires and billionaires get tax breaks.